Good evening, everybody. I'm back. Thank you for tuning in. I really appreciate your attention. This video is going to be about Donald Trump. I just did the Hillary video, so I think it's only right that I do one for Mr. Trump. And the purpose of me doing this video is to I know a lot of people still vote in the national elections, so I think it's only right that as much information and history as possible for individuals that are actually looking at Hillary Clinton or looking at Donald Trump. So I wanted to do the Trump one because I think that Trump is really the white Obama. The same thing that Obama was offering to people when he got elected for his 2 terms in terms of hope. I think Trump represents the exact same thing, but mostly for white males. White America, but mostly for white males. So I think that's important. So I think Trump is the white Obama. He's the new Obama. He's the hope for white males. And a lot of people are asking, I notice when I hear and read and listen and see conversations with people get into debates and arguments about Trump, if he's racist or not, I notice a lot of people, they don't know how to talk to conservatives and kind of rebut or debate on that point. I personally don't care if Trump is racist. Everyone has a right to be what they want, as long as you don't harm the next person. So if he is, I like the fact that he's blatant. That's what I respect about him. Even if he is racist, in my opinion, I think the fact that he's open about it is good because we know what we're getting. But a lot of people will say, "Oh, you have no evidence that he's racist," and things like that. And when people say this, I notice that a lot of people don't know how to respond. They'll get emotional. So I wanted to do this video to kind of give a context for Donald Trump, a kind of how geography has helped shape who this man is, so we can kind of get a clear picture and assessment of what we're dealing with. So with that, I think the best way, not just for Trump, but the best way to understand any New Yorker, especially a successful New Yorker, a famous New Yorker, someone that's known nationwide and has achieved a success on the mass level and that is well known, I think the best way to understand that type of individual, that type of New Yorker, is first to understand New York. And when you add racism to the picture, I think the best way to understand a person that's successful on the mass level from New York and you think they're racist is to look back at the 1980s. Now, I always said that race in this country is best examined not by the present, but by the past. Things in general. But if you want to look at events that happen, I say look at 50-year cycles, period. But in terms of race, I think the best time period in America to understand racism and race in this country is the 1800s, primarily the mid-1800s, like around the Civil War and up. And then after that, the best time would be the turn of the 1900s, early 1900s, and then the 1960s. So I think in that order, mid-1800s, turn of the century 1900s, and the 1860s is the best time to understand and study race to get a clear picture of racism in general in America and especially with the events that's happening now. But one period to look at in terms of understanding New Yorkers, right, or like Donald Trump, is you have to look at New York in the 1980s. New York in the 1980s is very, very symbolic. It was probably the most racially charged environment in America, period. I think New York might have been the most dangerous and most racially charged place in America during the 1980s. So to understand Trump, it's good to look at Donald Trump during this time period. Now, before I get into Trump and this time period, I want to give a little backdrop to what was going on in New York in the 1980s. Obviously, crack, drugs was everywhere. But in the 1980s, it wasn't just the drug epidemic and the crime epidemic, it was the race epidemic that was happening in New York. In the 1980s, you had a lot of racial incidents, but even growing up in New York as a child, there were certain incidences that just stood out, even if you couldn't really process because you've heard about it. There were certain names, events, and places that you always heard about. You know, like there's certain names that you always heard in events you always heard about growing up. You always heard about Al Sharpton. You always heard about Jesse Jackson, Mayor Koch, David Dinkins, Donald Trump. You also heard about places like Bensonhurst, Bed-Stuy, just Brooklyn in general, Wall Street, Yusef Hawkins, who I'm going to cover. So these are all things that just buzzed around your ears if you was a New Yorker. Even if you were small, from what you could remember, these are things that you just knew. These were things associated with New York. In 1980s, there were like 4 events that happened. 3 of them just was huge, right? One of the events that happened was, and now I'm going to get into Trump and then mention the other events, was the Central Park 5. There was an incident in Central Park where a jogger got brutally beaten and raped and everything. This was huge in the 1980s. And I'm not going to cover all the details of the story, but for the most part, the people, it was a mob of males that night, black and Hispanic. And they was just bugging out in Central Park. So when she got raped and brutally assaulted, there were some individuals that got connected to that incident. And these later became known as the Central Park 5. So these were like 14, 15, 16-year-olds. These 5 young boys, they got pulled in for this assault. And the media demonized them, called them a wolf pack, called them savages. Some people called for them to be castrated. I mean, and it was all white people. And they were just brutal to these young men. So long story short, these young men, they got convicted. Now, mind you, these are minors. They're all under 18. Minors. What makes this sinister, though, is that there was no DNA evidence and there was really nothing that linked them. But the reason they got arrested, it was really 2 reasons. The one was that there were so many young boys in the park, but these 5 got pulled in. They were coerced into confessing. So each of these young men was pulled into the side on their own, and they was beat in the head psychologically, and they were forced to confess. So each of these young men told on each other and confessed to it. Now mind you, these are young boys, these are teenagers, they scared for their life. So they confessed. Despite there being no other evidence, they were convicted solely off their confession. But there was one other factor that contributed to them getting convicted, and that was Donald Trump. Donald Trump was like an accomplice to these 5 young black males getting arrested. Now, what did Donald Trump do? And this is why I say, when you're asking yourself, is Donald Trump racist, and people can't come up with concrete evidence, you have to look at Donald Trump's behavior during the 1980s and then work your way up till now, and then you'll have a trail of his racism and his racist tendencies. Donald Trump, when this happened, he took out a full-page ad in 4 different New York newspapers. And in those ads, he called for the death penalty to be brought back and that these men should be killed. And he said in interviews, in addition to the front page, in addition to the full-page ads that he took out in 4 different newspapers, he was on TV interviews saying that he hates these men. And these men need to be killed, and we need to crack down on stuff like this. This is Donald Trump. Look it up. So you have to ask yourself, for a person to want these teenagers to be killed and to bring the death penalty back, which is against the law for minors, and I'm going to do another video on that Supreme Court decision, what he was asking for was something that was against the law. To have the death penalty for these minors was against the law of the land. So Donald Trump was he wanted to bring back something that was against the law for these young black males, right? He wanted to have them killed. He said, I hate them. Blatant. So much that he took out full-page ads in 4 different newspapers, which is pricey. What would possess a man to do and say all of this? It's past hate. It has to be something that's motivating the hate. Now, to be objective, some people might say, well, rape is a serious thing. Gang rape is even worse. So let's go off that. So let's go back to the 80s. We're still in the 80s. Let's go back to the other incidents. Outside of that, there were three major incidents. There was more, but there were three major incidents that made national headlines in terms of race. One of them was by the name of Willie Turk. Willie Turk was a transit officer. He worked for transit, basically. I guess he was stopping on his break or something like that, and he was going through Sheepshead Bay, which is southern Brooklyn, which was kind of still is, but highly racist back then. He stopped, and long story short, he was attacked, assaulted. A group of white men dragged him out of his car, dragged him across the street, killed him. Killed him. No Donald Trump. No full-page ads. No, this is horrible. None of that. Why? Because it was a black male. That was 1982, I believe. Fast forward. Another incident happened in 1989 as well, the same year as the Central Park Five. Yusef Hawkins. No, before we even get to that, I believe it was 1986. It was a Howard Beach incident. Again, southern Brooklyn. This time it was in Bensonhurst. Some young men were going down to southern Brooklyn in Bensonhurst. I believe, no, that was Yusef Hawkins. The Howard Beach incident was, they was there and they were just passing through for whatever reason. And these group of white men chased this individual, another black male, chased him down so much so I think he got hit by a car after they beat him up and he died. Brutally assaulted him before that. Group of white men in southern Brooklyn in Bensonhurst. That happened in 86, I believe. In 1989, a third incident happened with a black male. So far we got two black males brutally beaten by a group of white men. No Donald Trump, no front page ad, no clips, no nothing. Racist. Third incident, Yusef Hawkins in 1989. I think he was going there to buy a car, responded to some kind of ad to buy a car. Long story short, these group of white men thought that he was the boyfriend to this white chick in their neighborhood, beat him down, killed him. And it was this incident too that Al Sharpton started to gain his notoriety. Killed this man, Yusef Hawkins, beat him down, group of white men. This was also in Bensonhurst. If you look at the movie Jungle Fever, that was also in Bensonhurst, that whole dynamic. So why do I mention all of this? Donald Trump in the 80s, he was quiet on all of this. No outrage, no ads, no full-page ads, nothing. No, this is an atrocity, none of that, because it was white men. So when people ask, is Donald Trump racist? Hell yeah, he's racist. We're not going to beat around the bush. Just look at the environment and climate that he came up with. But when it came to this Central Park jogger, right, Donald Trump went ham. He went all out. And the ironic part is, this Central Park jogger, unlike the three black men that got assaulted by these nasty white men, she didn't die. They died. She didn't die. She actually went on to run a marathon in 95, and I think she wrote a book or something like that. Not to mention the press made it a point not to mention her name at all. But they demonized these young men. What happened to the young men? It turns out that the five individuals from the Central Park Five didn't even commit the crime at all. They were completely innocent. How did they find out that they were innocent? The real person actually stepped up years later and admitted that he's the one that did it. So you have these 5 teenagers that did 7 years plus in jail for a crime that they did not commit. And a part of the reason why that happened was because Donald Trump was an accomplice for that, advocating that these men serve time in jail. Nasty. So yes, he's racist. And on top of that, the men finally, after some years, the city of New York awarded them like $40 million in total over that. And but they lost all that time. They lost their youth, and that's a large part because of Donald Trump. But to show how racist he is, to rub insult to injury, when the city awarded these innocent black males the money for losing their life pretty much in their childhood from the state of New York and the racist city New York is, or was, or both, he still didn't apologize. He said it's a shame that New York paid them. Can you imagine? The city of New York robbed these 5 teenagers of their youth for a crime they didn't commit, demonized them, called them to be castrated, villainized them in the newspaper for years. And Donald Trump, after it was found that they were innocent, he says that it's a shame that the city paid them this money, and said that it's a waste of taxpayers' money, and said that if he was mayor, he wouldn't have gave them anything. Can you imagine? This individual that helped put them behind bars, after they were innocent, he had the nerve to continue to say that he wouldn't have gave them anything, and that he's lucky that they got what they got. That's crazy. So this isn't the only incident that he has. This is just probably the major one, because it's so blatant to show that his prejudice and racism is there. If it's not racism, then what is it? Would he do this for anyone else if they were not black? No. And what, to make it further, was that during this Central Park incident, there was another incident where a woman in Brooklyn, okay? Woman in Brooklyn got thrown off a roof after she was raped. No full page ads from Donald Trump. No outrage. None of that. So how is it that you have this white woman that was raped and beat allegedly by these 5 black men, and it turns out that one of them was Hispanic. It was 4 black males, and the person that did the Central Park wasn't even black at all? How is it that you have another incident where a woman was raped and thrown off a roof, and you don't show the same outrage because she was from Brooklyn, different ethnicity? So it's clear that Donald Trump, and you could start to see his public roots of racism from the 80s, from that Central Park incident, the Central Park 5. And after that, it kind of escalated into other incidents in which you could see his racism. The only reason why it's able to be defended as if he's not is because it's coded. But if you go back to what made Donald Trump, if you go back to the geography and the environment of where he came from and his reaction to the stimulus and different events, you'll start to trace his racist roots, and then you could trace it up till now. So it's the same Donald Trump, except he's older in his ways, and that makes him more rooted and firm in things. So you have to keep that in mind. So with that, I wanted to do this video to show an origin of Donald Trump's racism nationally, so then you could work your way up to the 90s, the 2000s, and then the 2010s to kind of see his racist patterns, and then put the pieces together. So when you look at this man, and if you still want to vote, at least now you have a better history and you have a clear picture of who this gentleman is, just like with Hillary Clinton. With that, thank you for your time. I greatly appreciate it. And I'm going to continue to do more on Donald Trump files and also Bill and Hillary, just so we can have a better historical context of who these individuals are, so we can know what we're dealing with. Peace.